So part of treatment of sexual addiction includes developing an individualized sexual health plan. So it's akin to treatment of eating disorders. Everybody has to learn how to have a healthy relationship with their sexuality, just like somebody who is healing from an eating disorder has to learn how to have a healthy relationship with food. And that looks different for different people. And so because sex addiction is so varied, each client has to develop an individualized plan that fits for them. And so CSATs have a template that we use for this. It's called the 3-circle methodology, which we're going to go over in just a minute. But part of developing a sexual health plan, the first step of that for treatment providers is to assess the arousal template. So if you're working in the field of compulsive sexual behavior, you'll hear people talk about the arousal template, and it's important for you to know what that means. So an arousal template is basically your erotic map, or what it is that you're attracted to and aroused by. So the arousal template is influenced by a lot of different factors. Obviously, your genetics, your physiology, what feels good to you. There are aspects of your arousal template that are learned, and it's also very cultural. You pick up messages in your environment from your culture, from your family, from your faith background, from the media, about what is sexy, what is arousing, and we basically get information from all of these different sources to determine what is arousing to us. So, for example, our early childhood years are considered very formative for our developing sexuality. So, for example, the ages between like 6 and 12 are thought to be very formative for the arousal template. So when people have sexual experiences when they're young, that can influence our arousal template. So in very healthy, normal ways. So for example, let's say my father had blue eyes. The first boy that I was attracted to had blue eyes, and that became something that I really fancied later in life, just as an example. And then there are ways that the arousal template can be impacted that are from learned experiences that can also change our arousal template in ways that can impact compulsive sexual behavior at a later point in time. So for example, this drawing here was from a client that I worked with many years ago that had a fetish around lingerie and transvestic fetishism. So for example, when he was young, when he was about 5 years old, his sisters and his cousins pinned him down, put on women's lingerie, put women's underwear on him. And they thought it was funny. For him, it was a bit traumatic because he had some shame around that behavior. And over time, he started putting on women's lingerie, dressing in women's lingerie, and he ended up having some distress around that. So that's a typical fetish. Now, for some people, you're able to just kind of work with them that only have fetish behavior. You just work with them, and sometimes you help them get more comfortable with whatever their fetish is, and reduce their shame around that, and have some acceptance around that fetish behavior. For other people, a paraphilia might be more damaging, or behavior that could be illegal or deviant. For example, this was a client that I worked with when he was young. He was about 6 or 7. The first time he remembers feeling sexual, he was watching his babysitter change bathing suits through a window. And so that became very arousing to him, and he became a voyeur. And that behavior got him in trouble over time and started to become problematic. So, arousal templates, for most people, we all have arousal template. It contains all different things that we find hot, sexy, and erotic, things that are fun and healthy. So in sex addiction, sometimes the arousal patterns can become problematic. So for example, if they become fixated, rigid, or obsessional, or they're unhealthy, maladaptive, or inappropriate in some way. So for example, if they're deviant, like for example, involved like bestiality or attraction towards children or something like that, that can be very problematic. If it violates the client's values or violates other people's boundaries. So those are some examples of when the arousal template becomes problematic. Now, one of the things that we want to always keep in mind is sometimes people will come to sex addiction treatment because they are uncomfortable or have unwanted same-sex attraction. Now, for us at IITAP, part of our core beliefs is that we celebrate diversity, and our ethical guidelines promote non-discrimination of race, creed, color, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender expression, age, height, weight, physical, mental ability, veteran status, military obligations, marital status. And when it comes to the arousal template, when people come in wanting to change their orientation, we are very clear, and it's part of the CSAT training, that all of our therapists will sign off paperwork that indicates that they do not practice or condone reparative therapy. So reparative therapy is expressing to a client that they can help change their orientation. So ITAP takes the position that homosexuality is not pathological and is not a mental illness. So sex addiction is not defined by the type of sexual act and the gender of the sexual partner. So we always encourage our CSATs to be supportive and LGBTQ affirmative in their process of helping the client come to their own determination of what's healthy for them. So the sexual health plan, when it comes to developing their individualized plan, this is an example of the 3 circles. So the inner circle is the abstinence list. So the client puts here all the behaviors that have been problematic for them in the past. And so this might include things like pornography, strip clubs, massage parlors, anonymous hookups, those types of things. So the client lists out everything that they consider what we call their bottom line behaviors. So these are the behaviors that, if they occur again, constitute a relapse. Now, the middle circle is the boundaries list. And so with this, the client tries to identify all the different areas of boundaries that they need to set up in order to protect that inner circle. So, for example, I'm not going to drive down the street where I used to pick up prostitutes. I'm not going to be on a computer that's unfiltered. I'm not going to have set up lunch dates at work with opposite sex colleagues, for example. So just things that maybe have led to problems in the past for that individual client, and things that they need to set up in order to protect their recovery. Now, breaking one of these boundaries doesn't necessarily constitute a relapse, but it's an alarm bell for the addict to pay more attention to their recovery and probably up their program in some way. So if clients are struggling, slipping on their boundaries, or relapsing on their plan, we encourage them to up their program, which means more groups, more therapy, more 12-step meetings, taking it to the next level. Now, that outer circle is their healthy sexual behaviors. And so one of the things you can do in couples work is having the couples define what that looks like for the two of them. And, oftentimes addicts are afraid that they're never going to have, erotic, healthy sex again. So starting to define what that might look like with them within their primary relationship can be a positive exercise. But oftentimes also the addicts, when doing their 3 circles, will put their recovery behaviors on their outer circle just as a reminder. So they're going to participate in meditation and yoga and therapy and 12-step, and what are all the things that they're going to do as part of their recovery plan will go in that outer circle. So that gives you an idea of what the 3 circles looks like. The other thing we do as part of the sexual health plan is we recommend a period of 90 days of sexual abstinence. And that's abstinence from everything: masturbation, sex with your partner. And the idea behind that is that it's a time frame in which the addict will stop acting out, and they can have emotions and feelings come up, and they are not going to medicating sexually. So they're having to learn how to use different tools, different strategies to cope with their emotions that don't involve medicating with sexual acting out. Some people also feel that it's a kind of a cooling off period for the brain to kind of recalibrate the dopamine systems in the brain, get back to a new homeostatic set point in the reward center. So explaining this to a partner, sometimes the partner therapist may need to support and explain why we do this, because obviously it's a consequence to the partner, who also has to go 90 days without sex with their significant other. Another important facet to addiction treatment for the addict is really emphasize how important and critical group therapy is. So cutting edge treatment is group. And really what we encourage CSATs to do is to let go of the idea of the 50-minute hour and think more about programmatic care, because most of our addicts cannot make it just on a 1-hour session every week. They need a lot more support than that, especially in early recovery. So we really emphasize the importance of group therapy as part of that process. And in the group, it helps by providing accountability. Sometimes the magic of the group is that the other group members can provide shame reduction and normalizing of their experience of addiction in a way that a therapist just cannot do alone in an individual session. And it also has the built-in positive component of the extra social support that's provide accountability for the client when not in therapy. So oftentimes the group members will support themselves, support one another outside of group, and be the first line of somebody to call when the addict feels triggered. So it's an important path for healing for the addicts. Oftentimes the groups include specific exercises from the task methodology and specific aspects to treatment to move them along, and also may involve some 12-step curriculum or some emphasis around what they're learning in their 12-step programs. We also suggest that participants are involved in the 12-step fellowships themselves. So there are 5 different S fellowships, and it's important to know some of the distinctions and differences between the S fellowships. The most important distinction is to understand how Sexaholics Anonymous differs from the rest of the group. The rest of the 12-step fellowships, like Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, etc. So Sexaholics Anonymous is the more conservative branch. And they do have what's called a sobriety imperative, meaning that the only acceptable forms of sexuality are in the form of a married relationship that includes a husband and a wife. And so, unfortunately, Sexaholics Anonymous is not particularly supportive of our single clients or our gay clients. And so what we recommend is that gay clients and single clients are referred to one of the other fellowships. Now, from a partner's perspective, the counterpart for Sexaholics Anonymous is S-Anon. And so those two fellowships work together. In terms of your partners, I do not blindly refer partners into S-Anon or COSA or POSA, which are the partner groups. Sometimes there are varied levels of health in those groups, and so you want to make sure that the group is really solid, that there's long-term recovery in those groups, and sometimes referring a new partner into those groups, it can be destabilizing. So my preference is initially to refer partners into small therapist-facilitated groups. And then when they're stable, to refer them into the partner supporting fellowships if you know you have good ones in the area. Some of the other fellowships are Sex Addicts Anonymous. They often have men's groups and women's groups, gender specific. You also have Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. They're the only ones that will look at sexual anorexia and love and relationship addiction, or they're more open to looking at those. A lot of women will come to this fellowship because of that. Sexual Recovery Anonymous is very similar to SLAA. And then Sexual Compulsives Anonymous is the most gay-friendly organization. A lot of times the heterosexual women will also join in that group because it's a good combination to go to group with the gay males. They also do a sexual health plan. Many of the, not including Sexaholics Anonymous, the other 12-step fellowships will also use a 3-circle methodology. The counterparts to these groups for partners are COSA, and there's also Partners of Sex Addicts Anonymous. Now, COSA and S-Anon do include a codependency perspective, which we'll talk about in the partner training. That's not a good fit for all partners. POSA does not include a codependency framework, so that could be a better fit for your partners that do not identify with codependency. So moving right along to evidence-based pharmacological interventions, some of the evidence-based pharmacological interventions include SSRIs, SNRIs, naltrexone, and the anticonvulsants. Those are the most commonly prescribed for sex addiction. And one of the things that we commonly recommend when considering treatment is that the addict has their own individual therapist and their own support group. The partner has their own individual therapist and their own support group, and that also that there's a couples therapist online. Now, not everybody's going to be able to do that all at once. Sometimes it's difficult from a financial perspective, but something to keep in mind is that when you have addiction, you have relapses and divorces and lies and secrets and a difficult population to treat the whole system. So that's why we recommend that, that we have separate partners therapists, separate addict therapists, and that there's a couples therapist to treat the system. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, CSATs and IITAP in general, we do a lot of emphasis on assessments. And so we have, as I mentioned earlier, the evaluation and assessment process is very comprehensive. And so we have numerous assessments that are very popular within our membership. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of these. The ZAST-R, which is a sexual addiction screening test, Pathos, SDI, the SDMI, the PTSIR, the MWASI, and the IPAST. Now, during the CPTT training, you will get training on both the PTSIR and the IPAST. So I'm not going to talk about those today, because we'll learn more about those in the training process. So the first thing is the pathos. So the pathos is a short screener that we recommend that people use in just terms of screening out sex addiction. Pathos is the Greek word for suffering, and it also stands for, it's similar to the CAGE in alcoholism, which is an acronym for, in our case, it's the 6 strongest predictor variables for sex addiction. So do you find yourself preoccupied with sexual thoughts? Do you hide some of your sexual behaviors from others? Have you ever sought help for sexual behavior you didn't like? Has anyone been hurt emotionally because of your sexual behavior? Do you feel controlled by your sexual desire? And when you have sex, do you feel depressed afterwards? So those are our 6 strongest predictor variables. So that's the pathos. The SDI is probably the most popular assessment. It is the most comprehensive. It's the largest broadband measure of sexual behaviors that exists. It has 47 scales of different behaviors and thought patterns common to sex addiction. And really, it's a battery of tests, not just one test. It includes the ZAST, which we'll talk about in a minute. It includes the diagnostic criteria, also the anorexia criteria. It evaluates a binge-purge pattern. It includes collateral indicators, which are things that commonly co-occur with sex addiction. There's a comorbid addiction screen for other addictions. It looks at the financial costs and the consequences of the addictive behavior. It also has some validity scales. It has a consistency scale, an exaggeration scale, an underreporting scale. It looks at attachment style and also the client's readiness for change. So as you can imagine, it's a very useful tool. The first thing on the SDI is the ZAST. Now this you can give independently. The ZAST is 45-item screening test. You can actually find that on sexhelp.com. If somebody's wondering, am I a sex addict? Could I possibly have a problem with it? They can go on to sexhelp.com, take the test. It plots them out, gives them a little profile. A chart similar to this will come up. And this is the ZAST course. So there are 20 items on the ZAST that indicate whether a client is an addict or not. And as you can see, the ZAST has pretty good discriminant validity. So once you start getting above a 7, you start to see that the clinical sample on that side, so you start to see the distribution increase for the clinical sample. When you're under 6, then that tends to be a non-compulsive behavior pattern. So people that score a 6 or more need further assessment. And when you start to get into like the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that's kind of your typical outpatient client. When you're up in the 16, 17, 18s, that's more of your typical inpatient client. So it can also be used as a bit of a measure of acuity as well. This is just an example of what the consequences looks like. It measures spiritual preoccupation, affective consequences, physiological consequences, legal, financial, and family and friends consequences. And it measures whether they're current or past. These are the behavioral scales. So the behavioral scales there's 20 of them, and it includes everything from fantasy to pornography use to networking for anonymous sex, swinging and group sex, cruising behavior, relationship addiction, conquest, which is basically meaningless sex, intrusive sex, which is boundary invasion, humiliation and domination, pain exchange, paying for sex, phone sex, voyeurism, exhibitionism, exploitive sex, which is abuse of trust and power, exploitive sex with children, drug interaction, object sex, and home-produced pornography. So these are basically measures these behaviors and also measures how preoccupied they are in these different areas. So I won't read all of these, but very similar to what we just went over, it looks at how preoccupied, how powerful it is on the arousal template. So somebody could, for example, never have participated in S&M. So on the behavior scales, they could be very low on pain exchange, but then they could be thinking about it a lot and preoccupied with a lot and can be part of their fantasy life, and they might be high on the preoccupation scales. So the SDI not only tells us about the behaviors, but it also tells us about the fantasy life. And then we have the higher order scales. Next, we also have the readiness for change. So the test will measure how ready are they. You know, obviously when we're talking about addiction treatment, you have a lot of individuals who are still in the recreational phase of their use, and they're really not that motivated. They're not taking it very seriously. They haven't experienced that crisis stage yet. And so, you know, where are they at? And so this includes the readiness for change scale. So as you can see, the SDI measures a lot of different aspects, all related to their behavior, and it really helps the therapist get a picture of what's going on with the client. Now, our next assessment tool is our newest tool. It's called the Sexual Digital Media Inventory. So basically, the SDMI assesses clients' use of sexual digital media, including porn, sex apps, chatting, sexting, virtual reality, erotica, sex robots, just as some examples. And similar to the SDI, it has a very comprehensive assessment. It starts off with demographics, age at first exposure. It also looks at gaming and social media. And then it has some of the same assessments that the SDI does, including the ZAS, the diagnostic criteria, a compulsive sexual behavior disorder screener, the SDMI itself, which we'll talk about in a minute. It looks at how much time they spend on the internet and how much time they spend masturbating to the internet. It looks at their drug use and also their attachment style, as does the SDI. The SDI also looks at attachment style. So here is the SDMI itself has two sections. It looks at the impact of the sexual digital media on the client's life, and also the areas of interest, which are the 12 domains of sexual interest and behaviors that are reflective of the client's arousal template. So if we look at the impact scales, these are some examples of what's measured on there. The client's shame. Are they experiencing sexual dysfunction? Are they having relationship problems because of their sexual digital media use? Do they have positive perceptions of the sexual digital media? Positive perceptions around pornography. Again, not pornography, you know, we look at pornography as a range. Not everybody that views pornography is going to have problems because of it. So there are some clients that come in that have positive perceptions around their pornography use. It has a pornography addiction scale. We also look at moral incongruence. How much does their behavior is incongruent with their values and their morals? How much are they isolating? Are they exploring new genres? Is their behavior escalating to arenas that they didn't think that they were normally aroused by, or behaviors that they normally hadn't participated in the past? Are they experiencing demoralization around their behaviors, which is like a sense of hopelessness, like nothing's going to be able to help them? Do they have cognitive and emotional impacts like feelings of stress and anxiety because of their use, and or body image issues? So those are the impact scales. The interest scales, these are just very common areas of interest when we talk about sexual digital media. So these are examples are virtual reality, violence, use of accelerators, which are like compilations in pornography, or things that where they can like a categorization system, search engines to accelerate their use, sexting, use of sex robots, home-produced pornography, high-risk illegal pornography, um, digital media that involves eroticized rage, erotic literature. Are they involved in communities relating to their digital media use, chatting, and sex apps? So just to give you an idea of what the printout looks like, it was one of our porn addicts. You can kind of see what their profile looks like. This is their interest scales. So a person was using a lot of sexting, chatting, and apps, and use of accelerators. So it kind of gives you a profile of what the client's been doing, and saves time in the assessment process to get all this information right up front. One of our other assessment instruments is called the MWASI, which stands for the Money and Work Adaptive Styles Index. And basically the MWASI, when we are assessing our clients, we are assessing for all addictions. And money oftentimes can interweave. There can be very compulsive patterns with money, and it also can interplay with a sex addiction in very unique ways. For example, like a sugar daddy website, or with prostitution, or where there's some sort of money exchanged, or um, dependent relationships, and where addicts are supporting their acting out partners, those types of things. So oftentimes doing a financial assessment can be very helpful. Excuse me. So the MWASI looks at many, many different domains in which money can be problematic for our clients. For example, money obsession, under-earning, deprivation, which is more about hoarding, codependent giving, dysfunctional relationship attachment, which is when you're in a relationship with somebody who's very dysfunctional with money, money aversion, crime, workaholism, poor work satisfaction, adrenaline jobs, which are jobs that are very intense and have high stakes, and have a lot of risk associated with them. Same with investments, being a business owner. There's some unique aspects to that that are assessed. Gambling, debting, shopping and spending, and problematic wealth. So you can see all the different dimensions that are assessed. So this is what a MWASI profile looks like, or printout looks like. So it divides domains in terms of money and then work. So we're looking at all of those. So this leads me into the fact that when we are looking at and just as an aside, we will go over the IPAS and the PTSIR with you during the CPTT training. So that's a good segue to talk about how treatment really needs to look at all addictions. And so we talk about addiction interaction, and there's a variety of ways that multiple addictions interact and coincide. So when you have somebody that's an addict, they may also have other compulsive behavior patterns that need to be evaluated, such as shopping, for example, shopping and spending, or internet gaming, or food addiction. And so oftentimes when we are doing relapse prevention, we want to make sure that the client has a plan for every behavior that they can be compulsive with, because we don't want to treat them for one addiction and have them slide into another addiction. So they get home from treatment and they're in recovery for their sex addiction, but then they gain 40 pounds in the first 6 months after treatment. Or somebody gets sober from their chemical dependency and slides back into their sex addiction. So we want to make sure that their relapse prevention looks at all the different ways that they self-medicate, because we have very high rates of co-occurrence with sex addiction. So for example, you can see here very high percentages with substances, about 40%. Compulsive exercise is another one to be concerned with. Eating disorders, anywhere from 22 to 38%. Compulsive workaholism is a very important one, very common with our sex addicts. They'll get out of treatment and then throw themselves right back into a 70-hour work week, and then they don't make it. They relapse in their primary addiction. Spending, gambling. So it's very important to evaluate all of this. So when we're looking at sex addiction, we look at the ways that they act out through binging, like binging on food, binging on sex and romance, alcohol, drugs, spending, debting, risk-taking, work, gambling. And then on the other hand, we also want to look at, are there ways that they're acting in? And which is about control and deprivation. And so we see this a lot for our partners in the sexual avoidance aspect, where we have sometimes we'll talk about it as sexual anorexia or sexual aversion. And for many addicts, it's not, it's very easy for them to act out with a porn or prostitution, but then with their partner, they are paralyzed and they're sexually anorexic. And so that's one of the reasons, we look at intimacy and attachment as part of this is very important, because, this sex is used to medicate and cope with intimacy and with fears and anxiety. So you can have acting in that revolves around control with food, with sex, with saving, with hoarding, with risk aversion, with compulsive athleticism. So we want to look when we're assessing and evaluating the different addictions, are there ways that they're binging and restricting and acting out in multiple ways? So for example, I worked with a female client who was a sex addict, and she'd been married 4 times. She would get married, gain 100 pounds, become sexually aversive, get divorced, lose 100 pounds, become sexually promiscuous, get married, gain 100 pounds, become aversive, get divorced, lose 100 pounds, become promiscuous again. So there was a pattern where she was flip-flopping food and sex between acting in and acting out. So we always want to be mindful of how these interplay with one another as part of our assessment. This is what we call addiction interaction. So here's a few client examples just to bring these thoughts home for you. So this is a client here. He's spinning his addictions on plates. You can see gambling, cocaine, the computer is pornography, the cell phone is work, and that's the one that's falling, and marijuana. And there's his partner in bed, like, where are you? You can see the anorexia in the relationship there. And this is a female client. She's sharing her story as she spirals downhill here. It starts off with cigarettes and sugar, binging on sugar. Then she binges on sex. You can see all the sexual liaisons there. Then the heart there, that's she falls in love. Then she has a manic episode. That little guy with his arms out is mania. Then she has alcohol, a broken heart, marijuana, more sex. There she is working until 11 p.m. at night, sleeping 12 to 14 hours a day. Marijuana, mood swings, pharmaceuticals, eventually gets to shooting up. So you can see lots of different ways that she's medicating. And this client, he's a workaholic. He's coming home late from work. He's got the supersized McDonald's meal on the front seat of the car, the directions to Trixie's, that's the prostitute. and the money is flying out the window. So you can see all of his addictions there, and you see the stop sign in the rearview mirror. So we want to assess and evaluate all of their addictions. Another very important component to the addict's treatment process is trauma, and to the partner's treatment process too. The partners may have a history of underlying trauma as well, which we're going to talk about in the CPTT training. However, most of our addicts, the majority of our addicts, have trauma history, and trauma treatment is a critical aspect of treatment. So, we often recommend that core trauma therapy is part of the process. Things like EMDR, somatic experiencing, biofeedback, internal family systems, art therapy, sensory motor psychotherapy, psychodrama, post-induction model, mindfulness, cognitive behavioral. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but most of our clients are going to need that in-depth trauma treatment. And then finally, from as a partner therapist, one of the most important aspects of the treatment for the addict and for the partner is the intensive couple and family therapy. And so we really emphasize the importance of family work as part of the healing process. The addicts would not make it if they if we didn't have the couple and family work. The partners are in their trauma and their trauma responses, when they are dysregulated and upset with the addicts, it's very triggering for the addicts for relapse. And so really, when we have good couple and family therapy, the addicts do better and the partners do better. And we're going to talk in depth about supporting both parties through the couples process during Mod 2 in the CPTT training. So anyway, that is a whole lot of information for you guys. I know that we are going to, be giving you a lot more during our CPTT, but this gives you a general overview of the addict and their treatment process. Now, I will be there during the training, and you'll be able to ask any questions. So if you had any questions left over about this video, feel free to ask me during the CPTT training, and I look so forward to meeting you, and welcome to the IITAP community.